Welcome. Thank you so much for coming. It's really an honor and a privilege to be here. I'm really excited, and I've been really enjoying all the science that we've been talking about so far. I reckon it's even cooler than the Canberra weather that we've been experiencing recently. But I'm also a scientist, and if you couldn't tell by my crazy mad scientist hair, I'm a chemist. And what happens most often when I tell people that I'm a chemist is they ask me a few things. They say, oh, I hated doing chemistry in high school, it's my worst subject. Or when are you going to win the Nobel Prize? Or do you know how to cook meth? And I'm not saying that I do, but if you want to come and talk to me later after the show, I've got a guide, it's over in Deep Belconnen, there's an address I can give you. No, I'm just messing with you. No, it's in Fishwick. But today I'm here to talk to you about the good drugs. So these are the medicines that taste terrible, but that's how you know they're good for you, because that's what your mum said. And when I say I cook drugs, what does that make you think of in your mind? You might think of something like Breaking Bad, cooking up a bunch of meth in a bathtub or something like that. But for me, making drugs looks a little bit more like this. So this is me having an existential crisis in our crying cubicle at work. And this happens fairly frequently because making drugs for medicine is a really long and challenging process. We need to design the drugs, we need to find a source of the drugs, and then we need to be able to come up with ways to modify them and make them better so that they can keep saving more lives. Fortunately though, this situation doesn't last for too long because of the proximity to a nearby therapeutic snack pack. And so this is really important, right, for us to develop new drugs because we need to keep on top of different bacteria and viruses constantly evolving new ways to defend against the things that we're throwing at them. So you can think of it a bit like trying to stay on top of assignments at uni or trying to stay on top of projects at work. But the worst that's going to happen in that case, if you fall behind, you might have to retake a class, which might not be great, but you might have to take an extra bit of time on this project. But when chemists fall behind, we might accidentally get a repeat of 2020, and no one really wants that, right? And I definitely don't. Awful time. And so when we're thinking about coming up with new drugs, we have to look at the history of it a little bit. So historically, drugs fall into one of two categories. We've got small molecules, like on the left up there, and we've got proteins. Now, small molecule drugs are what a lot of drugs are. Because they're small, they're really easy for our bodies to absorb, and so it's very easy for them to have their biological effects. But they tend to be very non-specific, and they'll affect everything in their path. And that tends to lead to a lot of undesirable side effects. And so a good example is drugs that are used for chemotherapy. And they might turn my mad scientist hair into the other kind of mad scientist hair. But the other half of this is proteins. And you've probably heard of proteins from your meat, or if you're a vegan, from your lentils, or from the powder that your muscle bros keep saying you should try if you want to get swole. But proteins are also really good as drugs because they are created from long chains of amino acids, which means they can interact very specifically with the enzymes in your body. And so they don't have the same kind of off-target side effects, but they're big. So each of those little bends in there is a single separate atom. And as you can see, much bigger than the structure on the left there. And that makes it hard for your body to absorb and difficult for it to do its job. They're so big that they're even bigger, or almost bigger, I should say, than my tummy after a snack pack. But I actually work in the sort of middle ground between proteins and small molecules. So if we take our protein and we take some molecular scissors, we can chop it up and get smaller versions. And those smaller versions are called peptides. And peptide drugs are really important because they kind of give you the best of both worlds. You get the small size, which allows your body to absorb it more easily, and you get the specificity that allows it to have less side effects. And so an example you might have heard of is Ozempic, which is really good for after I have had too many snack packs. And so the first step in this whole drug discovery process is we need inspiration. And for inspiration, we often turn to nature. And nature is a really great source of these medicinal products because different organisms, bacteria, fungi, they're all constantly coming up with new ways to defend against the barrage of viruses and pathogens that are out there in the world. And also, nature can't sue us for plagiarism for copying its ideas. But, if it did, it would probably be in a kangaroo court. But an example of one of these peptides that you might have heard of from nature is vancomycin, which is one of these last resort antibiotics that hospitals use to treat people when nothing else is working. But once we've decided on a target that we're trying to access, we need to come up with ways to synthesize it in the lab. And this is challenging for a number of reasons. So firstly, we don't have access to the same kind of enzymes that nature does to create these kinds of products. And we also don't use the same starting materials. And so we need to come up with new methods. And also, this is challenging because nature makes some really weird bonds. So this is the structure. Don't worry, I'm not going to quiz you on this later. But this is the structure of one of the peptides that I'm actually trying to make at the moment. And the bonds that I've got highlighted in pink up there, you're just going to have to trust me on this. They're weird. And so we have to come up with new techniques and new chemical methods to synthesize these kinds of weird bonds. But it's all well and good to just replicate one of these peptides from nature. The real power of chemistry lies in our ability to modify and make better the structures that we isolate from nature. Because nature is a bit like me when I was an undergrad student. It goes for the bare minimum. It goes for P's get degrees. And then, once it has a structure that works, it thinks, I'm done. That's all I need to do. It adopts a, if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of mentality. Kind of like what Arnott's should have done. But while nature has been playing this game of chimps with typewriters, evolving different defense mechanisms over millions and millions of years, we want to be able to do it a bit quicker than that. Fortunately, we have something that nature doesn't. Brains. And so, what are some of the things that we can do as chemists to make these peptides and these molecules better drugs? The first thing we can do is we can disguise them. So, if we have our peptide and we say put the molecular equivalent of a fake mustache or a silly hat on it, then the body just gets really confused. It has no idea what to do with these kinds of things. And that means that these peptides are allowed to stick around in our body for a little bit longer, doing their job and saving lives. So the chemical equivalent of this are things like macrocyclization, which is where we take one end of the peptide and connect it to the other end of the peptide. Or we can add different chains onto the side of our molecule to give them a little bit of extra stability. The second way that we can modify these peptides is we can equip them with extra weapons. So, how do we do this? First, we have to look at the way our peptides bind to the receptors in our bodies. So this big blue guy up here is the receptor for this peptide. And if we want to make this peptide bind better, we have to look at the structure of this receptor and see if there's a point on it that we could try and utilize. So for example, if this part of the peptide looked like my face, we could functionalize our peptide with a snack pack. And that would clearly increase the affinity between those two parts of the molecules. And this helps it bind better and do its job better. And so we can do this at multiple different parts of the molecule as well for a multi-pronged effect as well. So the chemical equivalent of this, if that region of the blue molecule was positively charged, we can think about adding more negative charges onto our peptide to make that binding better. And the last technique that we have is this idea of a Trojan horse, or a drug mule, if you will. So these Trojan horse kind of ideas are really good when we combine them with some of those more toxic small molecule drugs that I described earlier. So if we have a really good drug at treating something like cancer or malaria, but it's really toxic to the rest of your body, we can attach it to a peptide, and this peptide does two things. Firstly, it allows our toxic compound to be masked. It goes all stealth mode. And so we can then take this drug, and the peptide's second job is to carry it all over your body until it reaches the desired destination. And then once it's there, and only once it's there, do those cells have the machinery in them to cleave this bond between the peptide and the toxic drug, and it releases the toxic drug and can do its work, killing your parasites or your tumor or anything like that. So our lab is actually making these kinds of, we call them antibody drug conjugates or peptide drug conjugates to treat malaria by taking an anti-malarial drug, attaching it to a peptide, and then delivering it to the malaria parasites. But I like to think of them as tiny wooden mosquitoes for a little bit of irony. Tiny Trojan mosquitoes. So I really hope in these last 10 minutes or so, I've given you a little bit of insights into the critical role that chemistry plays in the design and development of new drugs. We're constantly on the lookout for new peptides that we can be using to treat different diseases and ways to modify them and make them better. So that way, when the next COVID does roll around, I will be able to hook you up with a little bit more than just meth. So thank you, everyone. You've been wonderful.